We will begin now. Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. What a pleasure it is to see all of you here today. Namaskar. We are here at the GCSP tonight, but also online. And thank you also for being here. We're really delighted. Our session today, the Geneva Security Debate, will be on India in the new geopolitical order. In June 2022, the GCSP launched the new platform, the Geneva Security Debates, and the debates consist of monthly discussions here at GCSP, where we bring together the world's leading thinkers and practitioners in interactive discussions. These are to inform policymakers here in international Geneva, but also abroad. And the idea is to have a better understanding of international politics and also security challenges that we are dealing with today, but also to improve and to build a more equitable, sustainable, and peaceful future. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Choi-Liang. I am the Senior Advisor of the Research and Policy Advice Department here at the GCSP. I'm also a faculty, adjunct faculty of the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po. Please now allow me to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Nico Luchsinger. He's the Executive Director of the Asia Society Switzerland, who is kindly co-hosting this event with us today. Mr. Luchsinger has been working with the Asia Society Switzerland since its inception in 2016 as head of programming, and now he's the executive director. He was a medieval historian by training, and he previously worked for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung and founded the global entrepreneurial community called Sandbox. Please take the floor. We are delighted to have you here and co-hosting this event with us today.
Thank you very much, Christina. I'm not going to take up too much of your time before we get into the really good stuff. But excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's debate. We are delighted as the Asia Society Switzerland to be able to co-host this event. Allow me just to very briefly introduce the work of our organization, seeing as we're not Geneva-based, not all of you may have heard of us. Asia Society Switzerland is a non-profit organization dedicated to fostering Asia competence. We are part of the global network of Asia Society with 16 centers around the world. Some of you may know our global president and CEO, Kyung-Hwa Kang, the former foreign minister of South Korea, who has been based in Geneva actually twice for several years and now sits on the board of both the Kofi Annan Foundation and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, both of which are based here in Geneva. So our work at the Asia Society rests on the hypothesis that Asia matters to the world and to Switzerland. Not just in economics, but in geopolitics, in society and culture, in global issues like climate change and regulating AI. And that our understanding of Asia thus needs to be both more comprehensive in scope, but also reach broader parts of Swiss society. And while we aim to cover the entire region of Asia, which let me tell you is not easy, I try every day and I fail. Of course, India and the question of what role it plays on the global stage has loomed very large on our minds and in our program in the last few years, which is why I'm delighted that we get to co-host tonight's very important discussion. We're especially delighted to have with us James Crabtree, who serves currently as the Toy Senior Fellow with Asia Society Switzerland, where he is providing insights and expertise to our stakeholders. If you have any interest in Asia, and I assume by your mere presence tonight that you do, at least in certain parts of it, I do invite you to engage with us through our online and in-person programs. Our upcoming flagship conference called State of Asia, also with participation of James Crabtree, takes place in Zurich. I know it's far away, but there's a train on November 7 and provides an excellent opportunity to get informed on the most important developments in the region. I'm very grateful to the Geneva Center for Security Policy and especially Linda Madutz for the opportunity to co-host this event. Thank you to all of our esteemed panelists and of course to all of you for being here. And obviously, thank you, Christina, for being our host and moderator tonight. And I'm handing over to you for what is hopefully an engaging and interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Nico. And thank you for kicking off our 25th Geneva security debate. I will now focus on what the debate will be about to give you sort of a headlines of what we're going to discuss. And then I'm going to have the privilege to introduce my esteemed panelists. First of all, India faces pivotal questions about its foreign security and economic policies amid a very shifting global landscape of rising and established powers. Our debate will be structured in three parts. In the first part, we will focus on setting the scene, looking at the 2024 elections outcomes, which has resulted now in a third Modi government. How has the government shaped India's foreign security and economic policies, and how he will continue to do so in this new orientation that he has. In the second part of the debate, we will focus on India's role in today's geopolitical landscape. Does India deserve a seat at the table of great powers, and how can this be achieved? And in the third part, we will focus on the future by addressing the burning global issues that are currently catapulting the world into chaos. The war in Ukraine, the current China-US rivalry, and we will focus on what will be India's role, looking at now, but also into the future. So now let me introduce my esteemed colleagues and speakers. First of all, let me start with Ambassador Pankaj Saran. He is a former diplomat, 40 years of experience in foreign strategic and national security. From 2018 to 2021, he served as the Deputy National Security Advisor to Strategic Affairs under Prime Minister Modi, where he focused on regional global strategy formulation, including maritime security and Arctic affairs, neighborhood policy, technology, and economic security. That's quite a dossier. Pankaj Saran is presently convener of NatStrat, which is an amazing Delhi-based independent center for research with amazing podcasts. I highly recommend it. And he is a member of the National Security Advisory Board. Dr. Milan Vaishnav is the Senior Fellow and Director of the South Asia Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he is also the host of a great podcast called Grand Tamasha at Carnegie. His primary research focus is on political economy of India, and he examines issues such as corruption, governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. He also conducts research on Indian diaspora. He is the author of the award-winning book, When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, Yale University Press. And he's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and he's also taught at Columbia and George Washington Universities. And last but not least, Mr. James Crabtree is a distinguished visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's a geopolitical analyst, prize-winning author of The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, also an extraordinary book. Prior to joining ECFR, he was the Singapore-based executive director of IISS, where he helped organize the famous Shangri-La dialogues conferences, and he's also an associate professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School. James spent 10 years as a journalist and foreign correspondent for the Financial Times. He is currently a columnist for foreign policy, and he's writing extremely excellent pieces there. He's also this former senior advisor in the UK Prime Minister's strategy unit of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. So you can see I have an unbelievably wonderful role tonight to ask questions to these extraordinary people who have worked so hard and achieved so much. So thank you for being here. We are absolutely delighted. So for setting the scene, we're going to talk about domestic politics. Let me first talk about the Modi government. Now it's in its third term. It's facing a complex set of dynamics in its domestic foreign and security policy. India's being shaped by its rapid economic growth, but as well as the rising geopolitical tensions and internal challenges. So Pankaj, let me start out with you. How would you describe the major transformations in India that it's been facing, and how do the election results fit into the overall picture of these transformations? Thank you.
Firstly, thank you very much, Christina, and I want to thank GCSP and the Asia Society for putting this together. It's really a great pleasure to be sitting in Geneva in front of this wonderful audience. Look, I think, to put it in a nutshell, I think the transformation of India is a humongous exercise. Let me put it like this. It's a combination of what's happening in Africa, in Europe, and in China. In Africa, in terms of numbers, the population of India is almost similar to that of Africa. We are talking of 1.4 billion people. Europe, in terms of diversity, Europe has 28, the European Union has 28 member states. And China, in terms of the economic transformation. So in India, you see bits of Africa, Europe, and China coming together. And this is all happening within a democratic framework. From 1947 till today, we've had many elections, not perfect, but they have been held. All transfers of power have been peaceful. There's been no serious allegations of elections being rigged. So I think the transformation of India is happening at a scale and at a speed and under a democratic framework which is quite unprecedented in contemporary history. And I think that's really, and the numbers are, if you look at some of the numbers, they're just mind-boggling. But what we see here is a vast swath of humanity trying to lift itself out of poverty. And so there is everything happening there. I mean, in terms of economic transformation, social, political. The recent elections a few months ago, the registered electorate was 960 million people who were registered voters. We managed the elections. And this government, of course, does not have a 50% majority. We have a coalition government in Delhi. But out of the 28 states in India, the ruling BJP is in power only in 16 of those states. So the idea that there is a unitary kind of one-size-fits-all political constellation in India is wrong, because the diversity of India is manifested in the way states are being governed. So, of course, if you have a population of that size, you also have problems of that size. So this is maybe just in terms of introduction.
I'm now going to ask James. Pankaj already highlighted the issues now that he doesn't have the full coalition government is not supportive of him completely. So Modi is popular, but even after 2 terms of power, we see now that after 2 majority terms in parliament, the Modi government is now ruling under a coalition. So what are the potential implications of this for India's foreign policy making?
So I think I'm not sure there are going to be that many implications for Indian foreign policy making. I mean, Milan and the ambassador might disagree. I think that the election results are going to see a kind of broad continuity of foreign policy making, as in there won't be huge changes. I think the biggest change, so to kind of take a step back, many people here are going to be India experts, but maybe some of you are coming to this just out of curiosity. So the assumption was going into the election that Narendra Modi would win another thumping majority. He was seen to be overwhelmingly popular. People had been expecting the natural gravity of politics to sort of take its toll eventually, and it never seemed to, as in, every election that the BJP won, they hit the ball straight out of the park. And this was the one where finally the sheen came off for reasons that we can discuss. I think the major effects of that will be domestic, as in had Modi, for good or ill, whether you are a big admirer of his, and many people are, or if you're a critic, and there are plenty of them, if he had won a third full majority with 350, 400 seats, which is what his party were projecting, it would have taken India in one direction that was increasingly sort of religious nationalist in orientation. And now that's much more difficult because he's part of a coalition with two minority parties that are sort of broadly secular in orientation. And so some of what the Prime Minister's more sort of fervent party supporters might have wanted to have happen is much more difficult to achieve. So that's a very fundamental change in the likely direction of the country over the next 5 or 10 years, given this election result. And as the ambassador said, one that happened, there were lots of people in India get very annoyed with Western critics of Indian democracy. One of the nicest things about this election was it was a sort of rebuke to those critics, as in the idea that India's democracy wasn't functioning very well. Well, this election was a perfect rebuke to that, because it showed that the democracy was functioning well. But in terms of the main trajectories of Indian foreign policy, which we'll go on to discuss, the shift particularly to be worried about China as India's primary security threat, and its reorientation to deepen relationships with the United States, the Quad countries, and Europe, I don't think that will be changed very much at all by the election outcome.
Beyond the elections, how is India transforming in terms of its domestic economic politics?
So one of the reasons, Milan has already done about 3 excellent podcasts sort of diving in great detail into what happened in the election. And as ever with India, it's incredibly complicated. But if you want to simplify grossly, then one of the main explanations that people talk about is that for all of the success of Modi as a strong projected leader, a great orator, a global statesman, and a very impressive top-line rate of growth, particularly over the last couple of years, that hasn't sort of filtered through to jobs and living standards for many ordinary Indians, of the third of the country that still works in agriculture, that is moving, gradually into towns and cities, and that was sort of the difference. At least that's part of the explanation. There are lots of other reasons that you could point to. And so I think one of the things that you're going to see is a government that, in a sense, responds to that recognizes that maybe in its first term it had a job to do, which is what my book was about, which was about the fixing of the mess that the country had got into in terms of kind of corporate debt and corruption. And they made reasonable progress on that, particularly the deleveraging of India's corporate economy, where the banking system had gone sort of hopelessly out of step. The second term was meant to be about supply-side economic reforms of various different sorts, structural economic reforms, which would then boost growth, but also give jobs to the 10 to 12 million new entrants into the Indian labor market every year. It has this huge demographic bulge. And that was the bit that delivered good growth figures at the top line, but not much in the way of employment, and didn't crack a number of the long-term economic problems that India has, for instance, not doing as well as it might in terms of export-focused manufacturing, large-scale labor-intensive manufacturing. So I think what you'll see in this third term is an attempt to fix some of that. You saw that in the recent budget, where there were attempts to create incentives for hiring and internships and jobs for young people, that sort of thing. Whether those things will work, we don't know. They tend not to, but there will certainly be an attempt to use the policy levers that the government has at its disposal to kind of answer the criticisms that have been made of it at the ballot box.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Milan, as an expert on India's political economy, how do you see the intricate relationship between politics, economics, and governance in India?
How long do you have for that answer? Because that's a very big and difficult question. First of all, thank you, GCSP and H Society for hosting us. I think maybe the just to gain traction on that, just think about the question of state capacity and public institutions in India. I think in many respects, India aspires to be a 21st century power. Clearly, that is its stated ambition. but still operates with a largely 19th century kind of colonial state apparatus, right? So as economic, political, social mobilization have grown, the pace of institutional development, change, regeneration has not kept up, right? And I think we often get trapped when we have these conversations, whether it's here in Switzerland, in the United States, in India, about, do we need a big state? Do we need a small state? And I think in India, the fact is we have a relatively small state that is doing far too many things, right? And so I think the challenge for India is building the core competencies of the state, right? If we go back and we read our Max Weber and we think about, what is it that the state is really supposed to do, right? Collect revenue, provide law and order, deliver basic public goods, administer justice. So to beef up those things while trimming some of the fat, right? Which means reducing the red tape, right? Kind of trying to streamline the thicket of rules and regulations that often kind of stymie individual innovation or entrepreneurship. I think a second issue is thinking about how we get the balance of the state right in terms of its geography, right? So if you think about the United States and China, just to take two comparators, those countries are biggest at the local level, but relatively small at the central and state level. India is the opposite, right? It is the smallest at the local level and the biggest at the state and national levels, right? So there's a kind of inversion, I think a gradual push towards saying we need to actually provide stronger, more present sort of local government. Let me just say a final thing, because I think one of the pushbacks that you often get when you discuss this issue is, well, isn't India using technology as a way to leapfrog some of its deficiencies? And I think undoubtedly what India has managed to do with things like digital public infrastructure, technology, unique biometric identification are truly stunning, right, in a comparative sense. But I think technology can augment the state, but it doesn't necessarily substitute for state capacity, right? So if you think about the power, for instance, of India's kind of digital public infrastructure and this unique identification program, it can tell you when you come to get your good and service from the state whether you are a beneficiary of this program or not, right? But it can't tell you whether the beneficiary list is correct, whether you should be a beneficiary or not, right? So I think that is still what requires greater state capability. I think that's really where the big push needs to be for India going forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much. James, you already mentioned your book, The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's Gilded Age. In this book, you explored India's wealth explosion back to 1991 when India opened up its economy. And as you highlighted in your book, billionaires wielded immense political influence and power. However, despite enormous wealth at the top, India's infrastructure remains underdeveloped in many areas, and millions of Indians are struggling in slums and rural poverty. What do you think India should do to address these inequalities which threaten the stability of its democracy?
Again, that's a big question. So I'll put cards on the table, which was, I can't speak for Milan or the ambassador, but I wasn't invited to the Ambani wedding. I don't know about you guys. In fact, I was sued by a member of the Ambani family. I was sued by the younger brother who decided took a disliking to me. So yeah, I lived in India from 2011 to 2016, and I was completely captivated by the sort of the rise of the super rich in India. And it's a sort of stunning story, as in, if you go back to the mid-1990s, India had no billionaires. If you went to 10 years forward, there were a sort of small handful, and then you had this explosion. Where now, I checked the Forbes list last week, it's now up to 200. So India has more billionaires than any other countries. I think any other country apart from the US and China. You might say, that's great. India has a seventh or a sixth of the world's population, so it should have a seventh or a sixth of the world's billionaires. And there are plenty of people who feel like there's no particular problem with the rise of extreme wealth, as long as the rising tide is lifting all boats. The argument that I was trying to make was that with this accumulation of wealth at the very top comes a level of social inequality which is developmentally damaging, as in all of the success stories of Asia, none of them look like Denmark, sort of South Korea, Singapore. These are not egalitarian countries in the sort of European sense. I mean, Japan, you can make an argument for. But India now has a level of inequality which is really only comparable to Latin American countries and South Africa. And if you start out at that level, it's very, very difficult to put the toothpaste back in the tube later, as in the kind of classic measure is you become more unequal as you grow rich, and then as you get very rich, you can kind of become more equal again. The risk is if you start out hyper unequal, then you stay that way, and that's what's happened to Brazil and Venezuela and South Africa. And that is a path that I think most reasonable people can agree is not optimal. It creates all sorts of problems. So I suppose that was the argument that I was trying to make. And what do you do about that? Well, it's partly a story about the bottom, which is exactly what Milan is talking about, that equal countries need to have a basic state infrastructure that sort of funds opportunity at the bottom of society, basic primary education, healthcare, things like that. That's what the East Asian Tigers built in the early stages when they were moving from an emerging economy to a middle-income economy. And then you need action at the top. You have to have the kind of taxation instruments that most countries have, higher taxation on the rich. It's no secret that income tax paying in India is not a kind of national sport. And so there is sort of range of measures of that sort, not terribly complicated, as in the kind of measures that most emerging economies introduce over time, but the kind of things that will bring this sort of stratospheric level of inequality back down a little bit. So my book, the one final point, the Billionaire Raj, the title was borrowed by Thomas Piketty and some co-authors in a report earlier this year, which made the point that according to their data, inequality levels in India are now higher than they were under the British colonial period. And I guess the point that they were trying to make is that I think reasonable people should be able to agree that that's probably not a good thing, and therefore there should be measures taken to address this. I'm sort of skeptical that this has been a priority of the Modi government. I mean, I think there are many things that the Modi government has done which are positive. I don't think this is one that they've really kind of grappled with. And so, when I listen, I don't want to be too positive about the Chinese Communist Party, but when I listen to the drive there for common prosperity, the sort of greater social equality at the top and the bottom, I've often thought, maybe India could learn a thing or two from that as well.
Thank you so much. Milan, you've also written extensively on this topic. In your book, you have a book also called When Crime Pays Money and Muscle in Indian Politics. What do you think are some solutions that could help India in dealing with this corruption? And do you think Prime Minister Modi is on a good path in this regard? And what do you think should be his strategic principles?
Well, I think look, I think there's no question that in the past 10 years, I think the government has done a number of things to try and address the corruption problem, right? I mean, we talked already about this idea of creating digital public infrastructure, trying to eliminate things like ghost beneficiaries of programs and so on and so forth. We've seen a move when it comes to natural resources, instead of giving them out to, your favorite cronies, going through an auctioning system, greater kind of electronic tendering of government procurement, such like that. I think those would all be in the positive. I think the real challenge, which I don't think this government has cracked, and to be fair, no previous government has cracked it either, is when it comes to political finance. I think it's sort of the worst kept secret in India that the way in which politics is funded is the sort of wellspring of a large swath of corruption in India. And I think this government introduced a new method of political giving, controversial new method known as electoral bonds. And basically the idea was that any firm, individual, or association could go to a public sector bank, purchase a bond, and basically any quantity, and donate that into the registered bank account of a political party. The upshot being neither the donor nor the recipient would have to disclose that transaction. What it did was to move political funding through the banking system. I think many people saw that as a positive. but it was absolutely terrible for transparency, right? Because neither the general public, nor the media, nor the voter would be able to connect the dots between who gave and to whom. It just so happened that right before the election, in a pretty surprising decision, the Supreme Court ruled that that scheme was unconstitutional. So we're now back to sort of square one. So what are some of the principles that could guide a kind of reform? So I think one is clearly just pushing for full transparency, right? At a moment when even a kind of corner street vendor is using digital means of payment, there's no reason why political parties couldn't be mandated to make sure all transactions they process are fully digital, right? So get rid of sort of cash completely. The second is ensure that there's disclosure, right? So that once you move things digital, it's much easier to basically submit in a timely fashion who's given and for what purpose and in what amount. And then the third is to say, look, in exchange for doing those things, we can rationalize what the limits are under the law of how much you can spend, right? And most people think the official limits are laughably small. But if you violate those standards of transparency and disclosure, then there's going to be real sanction, right? Then the election commission or the regulator is going to come down on you pretty hard, right? So I think as they're thinking about how you reconstruct a system, I would submit those are the three principles that you want to keep in mind as you try to create something new.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pankaj, how do you believe India's transformations are being perceived abroad, especially here in Europe?
I think you've just heard this from both the panelists, how India is being perceived overseas. But if you ask about Europe particularly, but overseas, I would say, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the reference point for judging India's strategies. As I said in my opening, what we are trying to do is to do what 54 countries in Africa are trying to do. And if India was 50 countries, we would be having a different discussion. The fact is that there is a resurgence of an Indianness, which is underway at a broader level, I would say. The idea that India is more than a nation state, it's a civilization, that is not something which is welcome, and it's not heard in a complimentary way in the West, particularly also in Europe. But I think you're seeing an assertion or a reassertion of that aspect of Indianness. But I would also say that, there was this very famous saying which was very popularly used by the British economist Joan Robinson, that everything you can truly say about India is true, but the opposite is also true. So I would say that probably would define what India is actually going through. I could also project the whole transformation process as being one of lifting, hundreds of millions of people above the poverty line. The fact that we are seriously looking at doubling the Indian GDP in the next 5 or 6 years. The time taken for moving from 1 trillion to 2 trillion is collapsing. There is regional imbalance. We have problems of, we have, let's say, 900 million individuals below the age of 35. With the best of intention, this is a huge governance challenge. So I'm not sure whether the complexities of India are understood, and therefore I'm actually very happy that these kind of discussions sitting in Geneva are beginning to take place about India. And I hope that these, help people to understand and to show interest in understanding India. There are very few secrets about India, as we can see. But there is a lot more to be understood about, what is driving India, what is keeping India together. Why is it, for example, that we have been able to sustain a democratic way of life, despite all the doomsayers in the 1940s and 50s who used to tell us that democracy is not for the poor. So there are things which are obviously not perfect. I don't think we should look for perfection, but is there improvement? Is there a steady rationalization and improvement in everything that we want to see? I think there is. And I think the numbers are humongous. So I would just say that issues of growth, of diversity, of everything else need to be better understood. I would say that.
So much. Thank you. We're now shifting gears into the geopolitics, and I think that's why a lot of you are here tonight. So I'm going to go back to you, Pankaj, to talk about how is India's neighborhood first policy evolving, and how is it dealing with issues such as the Bangladesh crisis and other regional concerns?
Yeah, so look, I think India lives in a tough neighborhood. The neighborhood first policy, in a sense, has always existed. I would argue that in the first 1 or 2 decades of India's independence, almost the entire Indian foreign policy was focused on handling its neighborhood, because we had a new neighborhood, we had a new country, and that country became 2 countries. And we actually had 2 new countries. We had Pakistan and the then Burma. So focus on the neighborhood has always been an intrinsic part of Indian foreign policy. In the last 10 years under the Modi government, the neighborhood first policy has occupied obviously a primary focus. I would say that the neighborhood is an area or a region which has always occupied the attention of the Prime Minister. It is something that is handled closely by him. I would say with the exception of Pakistan, the rest of the neighborhood has integrated, and we have moved forward in the process of integrating the neighborhood with the Indian economy. I think the integration is not just in terms of trade and economics, but it is in terms of connectivities, in terms of travel, in terms of values to some extent. So I think this project to make India a first responder, a stabilizer, a shock absorber, a sponge, a catalyst for interconnectivities and integration. So I think India is playing multiple roles in the region. Given the kind of fragile countries that surround India. In terms of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, I would say what's happened in Bangladesh is a historic development, the consequences of which will play out in the months and years ahead. I think we are just seeing the beginning of a new phase in Bangladesh. I'm not quite sure which way this is going to go. In Sri Lanka, I think the good story is that democracy has triumphed, and we have had a perfectly good election. And I'm hopeful that we can continue with this process, which we have begun with Sri Lanka, of, as I said, enhancing our integration and connectivity. These are all natural, geographical regions of India. And each of them, each of the neighbors, has its own, I mean, all of them see a different India. The India which Sri Lanka sees, and the India which Bangladesh sees, and the India which Nepal sees, and the India which Pakistan sees are all different. So they see different parts of the elephant. But the fact is, and for each of them, India has a different connotation. Sometimes it is imaginary, sometimes it is real. But that's the beauty of the whole project.
Thank you so much. And the complexity is way beyond this panel today, but thank you so much for highlighting that. James, should we be worried about Modi's visit to Russia? You wrote a wonderful piece entitled "Forget the Bear Hug," mentioning India's turn from Russia to the West. Can you highlight what you think are India's greatest strategic priorities now?
Yeah, I mean, the basic point that I was trying to make there was that I think in Europe, Europeans often misunderstand what's happening in India and the kind of fundamental direction of Indian strategic policymaking over the last 5 or 10 years, which, as I said in the beginning, is kind of reoriented around the threat emanated from China. And what a lot of Europeans saw was India's response to Ukraine, where, in a sense, there had been, I think, a sense in Europe and the US that, you know, we had grown closer to India, and this thing that had happened in Ukraine that was very important to kind of core Western interests had happened, and we thought India would kind of be on our side, and India didn't do that. India had, as usual, a kind of sense of its own core interests and a strong heritage relationship with Russia, which meant that it sort of took its own path. I think a lot of people concluded from that somehow India was, in a sense, with the heritage of Indian non-alignment in recent memory, thought, well, you know, India is an unreliable partner. It will never be friendly to the West, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's just, it's a sort of misreading of what Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, have been trying to do over recent years, which, and the ambassador may disagree with me, but my perception is that India is no longer trying to deepen its relationship with Russia, and to some degree is sort of kind of loosening its relationship with Russia a little bit. I mean, my former boss at the IISS used to say that countries view their geopolitical relationships a little bit like the way that portfolio managers in finance, this is really a Zurich point, not a Geneva point, but anyway, portfolio managers view their financial entanglements, and sort of India at the moment is sort of overweight Russia and feels like it should be appropriately weighted for Russia. And over the last 5 or 10 years has felt that it is underweight the United States, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Germany, France, Israel, and therefore has been kind of re-rating its geopolitical portfolio. And the most important part of that is the vastly stronger, deeper, more multifaceted relationship between India and the United States. That doesn't mean that India is going to become a US ally. It doesn't mean that if there's a war over Taiwan, that India is going to send troops to help the United States and its partners over Taiwan. It doesn't mean that India isn't going to buy cheap Russian oil if it comes its way. It doesn't mean that Mr. Modi isn't going to go to Moscow. But it does mean that India's foreign policy orientation has changed quite a lot in the last 10 years. And the most important parts of that are to strengthen relationships with the West, broadly conceived, including the kind of rich industrialized democracies of Asia, and to some degree to strengthen its relationship with other strategic middle powers like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But it's really the Western relationships that matter. And that's the point that I basically what I was saying was that if you're a European or you're North American, don't give up on India just because Mr. Modi goes to Moscow. Don't misread what's happening here in terms of India's geopolitical orientation.
Thank you. And did you want to chime in on that too as well? What do you think are the current dynamics of India-Russia relations and Modi's recent visit to Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, I actually would agree with a lot of what James has said.
I fear we're agreeing too much.
No, I would say, you know, I think the Modi approach is to put the horse before the cart. And the horse is India. And so you say, okay, look, where do I want the cart to go? I mean, who's the driver in this relationship? So I'm not asking myself the question, do I go to A, B, or C for the sake of it, or just because I have nothing else to do? I choose the relationships according to what suits me. So if I need to ensure that the poorest of the poor in India get cheap oil, I will go to Russia. So the relationships are driven by national interest, I would say. The diversification away from Russia in the military and defense field far predates Ukraine. In fact, it is a development that started in 2008, 9, 10, when Western sanctions against India were lifted. And that's when the Indians had the opportunity of actually going to non-Russian sources for. So I would say, number three, that if today India has internalized that you need technology for national development and economic purposes, and if that technology is available in the West, then I have no option but to enhance and strengthen my relationships in the hope that I will get that technology. It is not certain, but I will try. So yes, the playing field has opened, for sure. But you will continue to see the Russia relationship at work. And this is not because we are trying to maybe send signals to the others, but quite simply because it suits us. And I think there's also the sense which I think our leadership has spoken repeatedly, that India does not buy this proposition that the world of 2020s and 30s can still be viewed in the prism of the 50s and 60s, where it's either us or you, or either you are with us or against us, or a binary relationship. I think the days of the end of civilization or the end of history rather were premature. I mean, he wrote this in 1992 saying, this is the triumph of the Western liberal order. I mean, people would argue this is the beginning of history. I mean, the Indians and the Chinese would argue that.
Famous article by Francis Fukuyama. I'm sure you all were forced to read it at some point in your academic careers. Thank you so much. I'm now going to switch gears to China. Milind, you have written on this, you have spoken on this. How has the relationship between India and China changed since the 2020 border standoff? And is the recent increase in economic cooperation a sign of a shift in relations?
Just to be clear, I am the least qualified person on this panel to answer this question, but I will try nonetheless. Let me just say a couple of things. I think the first is that we should not underestimate the extent to which China's aggressive actions across and along the line of actual control in 2020 were a turning point. I think for a long time, India sought to cooperate on economic and trade issues while working to resolve very deeply felt grievances when it came to security tensions with China, and the border being one of the principal ones. And I think the 2020 crisis brought an end to that bifurcation, right? And I think two things happened in India. One is that public opinion in India on China really soured, right? We don't have great data on this, but I think the analogy that many people made is things have not been as bad in India since the 1962 war in terms of how people view China. The second is, as James mentioned earlier, this really helped to fuel a new era of US-India cooperation, including at the time of the crisis itself. Today, I think there's been a somewhat of a rethink, right? To say, okay, yes, we can't think of the security and economic domains as totally separate. They're deeply connected. But at the same time, we can't let our security issues completely dominate and take over, right? So if you look, for instance, at comments that the chief economic advisor to the government of India said in the Ministry of Finance's annual policy statement, he said, look, for India to boost its global exports, we can either integrate more closely into China's supply chain, or we have to promote Chinese foreign direct investment into India, and he batted for the latter option, right? Post-2020, India has virtually blocked most Chinese investment, most visas for Chinese nationals who wish to work in India. But I think it has now come to the point where it is reconsidering both of those things because it fears that it's losing out on billions in investments, right? So if you look, for instance, at Apple, which is famously soon going to be creating, I think, 1 out of every 4 iPhones in the world in India, when you bring Apple to a place like India, you're not just bringing Apple. You also need to bring the 14 Chinese-based component suppliers that make lenses, that make screens, that make headphone jacks and all of those things. And the government did quietly give permission to those 14 Chinese firms to set up shop, right? You're basically importing the entire ecosystem. So I think, one of the ironies of this whole situation is that in order for India to take advantage of what people call the China +1 moment, it actually can't close itself off from China completely.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So with India recently signing agreements with the US regarding military equipment and technology, is India aligning itself more with the US in its competition with China? And what should it do?
I think, I think it's, again, I think I'm surprised we're agreeing so much on the foreign policy aspects in this panel. But I think, yes, the Chinese drove India into US arms. And I think they realized it. It was a strategic blunder, what happened in 2020. I think it's not well known, the severity of the clash. We have, it literally, Chinese and Indian tanks were facing each other off at a gap of 50 meters at heights of something like 20,000 feet. So the confrontation was more than real. And as Milan said, I think they lost India. The question is for how long? And I think at this point in time, people are asking, so there is, like in the United States and in Europe, there is a multi-track approach to China. The corporates, the business community, and everyone else has a certain approach. The security establishment and the foreign policy establishment has a certain approach. And I think today in India, there is a very, very serious debate going on can you paper over these differences, or do you live with multiple China policies as India? One part of the decision makers are asking, does India live in permanent hostility or perpetual hostility with China? There is also a view whether there could be a hot war, a real hot war between India and China, or is it a case of a civilizational conflict which extends into generations? Because the fact of the matter is that both India and China are rising. India is going to be rising faster in percentage terms. So I think now the question is how all this is interpreted in Washington. There is no doubt that in the last 20 years, I would say, India's pivot to Washington is real. The relationship has actually become deeper. But the problem arises on account of mutual expectations of each other's behavior and policies. And I would say we should avoid the mistake of making China the glue in the India-US relationship. Because if that remains, or if that becomes the defining point or the factor, then we will run into problems. So I think the realities of the India-China relationship and the realities of the US-China relationship are quite different. But in the medium term, there is no doubt that we are going to face challenges with China.
Thank you so much. James, you've highlighted, we've seen now that what could be coming more and more, the West protecting its markets, and China needing to export its products elsewhere. So this is alarming India in the worry that China will dump its exports on India, and this could lead to a clash between China and the global South. So what do you think should be India's strategic priority in response to this?
So, I mean, let me make a broader point and then I'll address that. So just in terms of this point about, this is very big picture geopolitics. I mean, as the ambassador hinted, in some ways, India and China share an international worldview, as in, they both are professed advocates of a multipolar future, the kind of world that we're heading towards, which implicitly means a world in which major decisions and influence is less held in New York or Geneva and more in Delhi or Beijing. So it isn't that the two Asian powers are sort of set against each other. There are elements of worldview which are similar. I heard this, Samir Saran, who runs the Observer Research Foundation, had a lovely way of putting this, which is, he said, here's how you got to understand it. China believes in a unipolar Asia and a multipolar world. The United States believes in precisely the opposite. It believes in a unipolar world and a multipolar Asia. And India wants a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia. So that's sort of, at least for now, that's sort of India's professed policy. So these are quite different ways of looking at the world. And I guess the way I would, in very simplified terms, India and China, as the ambassador said, both rising, and they're sort of stepping on each other's toes. China started earlier, so China has moved into India's traditional areas of influence. So it's projecting power across the border, but it's also projecting power into the Indian Ocean. So the big worry in Delhi this week will be, will this new government in Sri Lanka turn out to be as pro-Chinese as the last government but one? It remains to be seen. But it certainly could be. This is a neo-Marxist government that has had quite warm links with the Chinese Communist Party. And so India looks around the Indian Ocean and it sees Chinese submarines and Chinese putative military bases and all sorts of things to worry about. The same will come the other way, as India grows more powerful, it will start stepping on China's toes in its traditional area of operation. It's doing this very delicately. It's building slightly stronger economic links to Taiwan. It's got much closer to Japan and Australia. Eventually, India will also begin to kind of project military force into East Asia. And so this is just a very complicated problem. You have the world's two largest countries, which share a very long common border and are going to conceive of their strategic national interests as occurring in the other's backyard. And that's just something that is going to have to be managed extremely carefully. Optimists will say, since 1962, this relationship has had its ups and downs, but India and China have managed this relationship with care and have not had another military conflict. And therefore, even in a moment in which something like the nuclear balance of power in Asia is changing very dramatically, you can have some confidence that these are two, mature, sensible, great powers in the making who may manage this, better than we expect. But that is one, if not the major issue of global geopolitics in the 21st century, is that the India-China relationship will become, as important as the China-America relationship is now. You asked me a more specific question about the role that China plays in the global south. The basic point I was making in this article was that China has been overproducing in Western eyes things like electronic vehicles, and therefore is in effect kind of dumping them on Western markets. As tariffs go up in the West, that means more of these goods are going to end up in emerging markets, and that will complicate China's relationship with the global south, which up until this point has been reasonably benign because China has been investing lots of money in the global south. I mean, I think perhaps the bigger, more interesting issue here is that India and China, in addition to competing with each other, are competing for which of them gets to be the sort of the spokesperson and leader of the global south, a role that they both very much want. And so, you saw that all across India's G20 chairmanship last year, that India is sort of courting the global south. China does exactly the same thing, and that's not that's not a conflict between India and China, but they have different models of the kind of role that they want to play. But it's just something to watch how these two sides are going to grapple with one another and sort of try to project influence with the many with Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now to the big question to end this section. Does India deserve a seat at the table of great powers? And what gaps in its foreign economic and domestic politics still need to be addressed? And what are the main factors that support India's claim to great power status?
I could turn it over to the ambassador. He might have a few things to say about the first one. Look, I mean, I don't see any realistic scenario under which the global community can deny the claims of the world's most populous country and the fifth largest economy. The question obviously is on what time scale. Will it happen in your or my lifetimes? And that obviously, we've seen there's been very limited progress towards greater inclusion of emerging powers of all kinds, India being one of them. I think, there's a terrific book by the LSE scholar Rohan Mukherjee, which looks at the foreign policy of rising powers as they relate to international institutions. And one of the points that he makes in the book is, countries like India have two major grievances when it comes to the international system. The first is around institutional openness To what extent do they allow for new membership? And the second is around procedural fairness. Conditional on being in those institutions, how fairly do they treat their members, right? And I think India, and this is where India and China actually have a lot in common, object to both of those things, right? India believes it should have a seat on the UN Security Council. Existing institutions aren't particularly open, but neither are they fair. If you look at, for instance, the emerging market share of quotas at places like the World Bank and the IMF. Now, the question is, what do you do about it, right? And I know we were going to get into this later, but maybe I'll bring it up now, is the question of the BRICS. Right? What is India's calculation vis-a-vis the BRICS? We've seen this group expand recently. There's been a lot of reporting to suggest India actually was opposed to that expansion because it would dilute the weight of the original members. But I think India has an incentive to be in the BRICS, not necessarily because it really believes it's going to be this alternative axis. But number one, the Chinese are there, and so they have to keep an eye on them, and it's better to be in the tent looking out than out of the tent looking in. But the second is, given that they're not getting any joy on institutional openness or procedural fairness, having the BRICS as a potential cudgel to try and move the West into greater reform, I think is very, very useful, right? The last thing I'll say about this is that just to kind of tie things together, I think there is much greater understanding in places like Washington, D.C. about India's foreign policy, both as it relates to the equation between Delhi and Moscow, as well as the equation between Delhi and Beijing. But I think the one group that has perhaps grown more skeptical about India is not the people who run South Asia policy. It's the people who work on international organizations, because they look at India's stance on Russia, Ukraine, and that gives them a lot of heartburn about what they could expect should they open up the club to India further.
Thank you. I'm going to let both of you address this question as well. So please, who would like to begin? James?
Which bit? There were three bits of it. Oh, I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's just perilously difficult that these international institutions are remade after wars, not before them. It's very, very difficult to reform them because, for reasons that an audience like this are all too well aware. If you let the Indians in, then everyone else wants to come in, if you see what I mean. And so the formulation in which you kind of come up with a system in which you expand these are difficult. So I agree with Milan. One of the dynamics around the creation of new kind of quasi-multilateral, minilateral institutions is they're adaptable. One of the incentives that China has in sort of taking the BRICS and turning it into a new institution isn't simply to give them a platform to bash the West every year, which is one primary role that the BRICS now has, that Putin can make a speech and Xi can make a speech, and it's a messaging opportunity. But it's also, it's malleable. It's sort of something that has growth potential. It can be expanded. The Americans don't have a veto. The Europeans don't have a veto. And so it gives you kind of policy space in the international system, and that's very attractive. And so that, in a sense, I think it's just a facet of the world that we're moving into, that as some of the existing institutions like the G20 have become less functional because they're internally divided, then the incentive to build new ones, be they minilateral or quasi-multilateral like the BRICS, just becomes greater. It's worth your while putting more diplomatic energy into these things. Ambassador.
Yeah, no, look, I don't think India's spending sleepless nights waiting for the UN Security Council to reform or to expand. I think, we're going about our business with the world in the full knowledge that global governance has collapsed. And there is no institution left to either prevent or to foresee or to solve global crises. I mean, we have two wars raging as we speak. And what's remarkable about both wars is that the United Nations is completely out of them. So I think the Indian case has been made ad nauseum. There's nothing new for me to say. I think our minister was here a few weeks ago. He's said it all. The question is, of course, no one cedes power, and that's the reality which India recognizes. You asked whether India deserves. I'm not sure whether there is a perfect candidate available in the world which can actually fit into that kind of a role. The fact is that India's exclusion is not going to prevent it from doing what it has to go forward and to advance and to expand its boundaries of foreign policy choices and its kind of role in the region and the world. I think that process will go on. Will it try to build and create other institutions which are more sector-specific, issue-specific? I think so. And I think in the last few years, we've seen new institutions and groups mushrooming. You will see more of that. So eventually what might happen is that the General Assembly and the Security Council and other agencies might find themselves out of the loop when it comes to solving real problems. So I think it's in the interest of global stability that you recognize that you don't have 50 countries today, you have 200 countries. So I think time is on India's side. As Milan said, who knows whether it will happen in my generation or someone else's. But I don't think there's anything stopping the logic of reform.
Thank you so much, James. You already mentioned the G20 and India's role as a leading voice in the global South. Do you think India will continue to, even after its G20 presidency, continue to be a platform about development, finance, debt relief, and climate change in global forums? Is this really its a role? Will it continue to influence multilateral processes? And do you think it's taking the lead on all these issues?
I mean, I think so. I think the major context, as Ambassador Saran said, is that forums like the G20, despite the success of India's presidency, are less functional than they used to be because they're internally divided. If you go back to 2008 and the financial crisis, when I was working in the Prime Minister's Stretch Unit under Gordon Brown, then that was a period in which the G20 was the dominant. It was the organization that saved the world. We're only 15 years on from that, and now the G20 is a far less functional organization. So that's because of the rise of great power competition and the sort of division, the decline in power of the West, the relative rise of sort of the larger of the emerging and developing economies. That said, I mean, I think India will continue. I think its role will not be restricted to development and climate finance and the kind of priorities that it was promoting. It has a role in all sorts of other areas as well. And as India rises in power, it will continue to exert influence. Mr. Jaishankar calls this the aim of being a leading power, as in, principally the dominant power in South Asia, and then taking a larger role in kind of participating in shaping international institutions. But, as India grows to become a great power, then it will take on the kind of role in international institutions that great powers have tended to take on.
Thank you. We've already jumped into the global landscape and the future of the global landscape. I wanted to highlight your new book, which is coming out. It's available apparently in some Amazons, but not in the Amazon that I was trying to buy the book on. But it's Institutional Roots of India's Security Policy, Oxford. It's coming out December 2024. Here in this new book, you're helping to demystify some of, I think, India's most secretive institutions, and you're shining a light on their operational aspects, especially as they concern India's foreign policy. So what do you think are the key institutions that will benefit India's security policy in the future?
So the objective of this was to, if you go back to kind of where we started, is when you think about the quality or the state of public institutions in India, right? We tend to think a lot about sort of doctrine. We tend to think about policy. We don't really think of them as organizations, right? So more from a kind of management or public administration lens. So this was an attempt to try and use that to analyze, I think, kind of 4 sets of institutions that are going to be incredibly important. The first is the armed services. The second is India's intelligence apparatus. The third are the paramilitary organizations that are in charge of kind of internal border security, and the final are the police and the investigative agencies. And we don't have time to kind of go into all of them, but I think what was interesting in looking across them is that there are 3 or 4 common themes that when you think about what needs to be done to kind of reshape these institutions for the challenges India faces today. The first and most obvious one that you see is real questions in terms of personnel shortcomings, right? I mean, again, going back to this idea of India being a relatively small state, I mean, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that, 1/3 of police posts across India lie vacant at any point in time, right? I mean, so there's a real sort of manpower crunch at the lowest level, right? I mean, here we're talking about sort of beat cops, right? There's a question of institutional rivalries. One of the greatest untold stories of the past 10 or 15 years is the huge rise in paramilitary organizations in India, which perform a variety of security tasks, but in many cases come into tension with the armed services because of questions about, where does my jurisdiction end and where does yours begin? Incidentally, a lot of these institutions were set up, after the 1962 war with China and the 65 war with Pakistan, right? I mean, for a very different time because of a set of critical junctures, which of course, things look somewhat different today. The last thing I'll say is that, there's also questions about sort of oversight. And I think this has really come into view with the recent allegations around, what people call murder for hire or targeted assassinations. Where you see even Indian members of parliament, not just from the opposition, including the ruling party, saying actually parliament and civilians should have greater oversight into how these institutions function, because right now they're sort of a black box, right? And this is a process that every democracy has gone through, right? I mean, there's been scandal after scandal in the United States about the extent to which organizations like the FBI or the CIA are subject to oversight and accountability, right? So what this attempts to do is to try to isolate kind of what these issues are with each of these clusters and try to, chart a path forward.
Thank you so much. James, India has embarked on an ambitious program to modernize its armed forces. The focus is now on this indigenous defense production under Make in India initiative. However, gaps still remain in areas like advanced weaponry, military logistics, and joint force operations, and as we've heard, also manpower and women power. The government must push to foster modernization to keep up with regional threats. So what are the most urgent regional threats and which ones should it prioritize?
We've covered a bit of this. I mean, in a sense, this is again a response to the threat from China. China is economically larger, but also military more powerful. So, India is modernizing all of its military. I think at the moment, one way you might think about this is that there's a sort of challenge. Modern militaries tend to invest. India has traditionally been a land-based military because it's been focused over the plains of northern India towards Pakistan. Modern militaries like the United States tend to be technologically heavily invest in technology, which is normally aircraft and ships. India's tension at the moment is it was planning a big naval modernization in order to kind of balance China's incursions into the Indian Ocean, but events on the border mean that it now has to invest more in its army. And so it has a lot of different and diverse needs. And as was mentioned, it also really wants and kind of covets the type of technological innovation, be that nuclear-powered submarines, all sorts of different capabilities that would give it a kind of step change from being a predominantly land-based military. So lots of modernization, but also plenty of kind of tensions as it tries to modernize what is a very large, people-heavy military establishment.
Thank you so much. I'm going to now talk a little bit about the Quad and India's participation in it. It underscores its focus on countering China, especially in the Indo-Pacific. but at the same time, it needs to balance its relationship with China. So how is India's participation in the Quad going to not look like a confrontational approach to China? How can it play that tightrope?
Yeah, no, well, the Chinese have a different view of Quad, and whatever we say is not believed in Beijing. So that's true. But I would only say that this debate on whether you should focus on the military and defense aspects, whether it should become a military alliance, or whether it has a larger purpose and logic. On that debate, I normally weigh in the latter, where I think that we should not narrow the Quad to its military dimension, for the reason that when you look at the evolution of India's military and defense relationships with the individual Quad members in the last 10, 15 years, they have grown exponentially, whether with the United States, with Japan, with Australia. The Quad, or any multilateral grouping by definition, reflects the least common denominator. Where the Quad can actually come in a systemic structural sense, and to go to the root of the problem in the Indo-Pacific, firstly, I think that the Quad and the West has woken up too late to what the Chinese have been doing in the Indo-Pacific for the last 20 or 30 years. And this is where we come into the whole Russia-China business, etc. India has been basically crying from the rooftops that, you need to focus on the future, not on the past. And this is something which is now beginning to be recognized in Western circles and chancelleries and in the strategic community. But the obsession with Russia is still a problem for India, because that takes away from the real, as far as we are concerned, the real issue of the future, where the writing is on the wall, you know where you're heading, but you don't have the plans for it. Where the Quad comes into, plays a role in my view, is that because of this neglect, the countries of the Indo-Pacific, which were typically small, fragile, poor, desperately in search of capital, in search of infrastructure, they had only one place to go: Beijing. They had no other choice. Today, if the Quad can provide that alternative, both in terms of a political model, in terms of finance, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of addressing their developmental needs, that will automatically reduce the salience of China and the dependence on China by all of these. Whether you look at Pakistan, you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Myanmar, the Pacific Islands, Cambodia, you name the country. So for them, China was the bank to go to. Now, if the Quad can provide that alternative, that, in my opinion, would be a much more enduring and sustainable approach to the problem.
Thank you so much. Milan, you wanted to chime in?
Tiny point. I think one of the conceptual mistakes that I think we've made, kind of in the foreign policy community, is to think about the Quad as this thing that happens when the heads of state come together, as happened recently in Delaware with Prime Minister Modi and President Biden and others, or when Minister Jaishankar meets his counterparts. But what's interesting is to see how that is actually, that formulation of these four countries doing business has filtered down to other levels of policymaking, right? So in diplomatic capitals like Geneva or New York, the Quad, through their representation here, is coordinating on issues, right? So you could be in a post like Bulgaria or Malawi, which ostensibly has nothing to do with the Indo-Pacific or the Quad, but this grouping of four countries now is coming together to discuss, policies, both on how to coordinate, ensuring there's no surprises, right? These are parts of the Quad I don't think we get that talked about enough, but it goes beyond just the kind of pageantry. I think it's becoming part of how governments are doing business, in different parts of the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I hope that you've already gotten some good ideas. I would now like to open the floor to the audience. So please, if you have a question, please keep it short because we have a lot of people here, and hopefully I can get to a lot of you. So yes, please go ahead. And if you want to introduce yourself, you don't have to, but if you would like to, you can go ahead.
My name is James Bronner. I'm an OCI living in Bangalore. Question to all of you or any of you, what influence on India's strategic position in the geopolitical world would the potential election of Desi in November have?
Thank you. We'll grab a couple. Yes, please, go ahead.
My name is Orko. I'm a student at the Graduate Institute itself. So, given we're talking about geopolitics and everything, India has currently been focusing a lot on economic corridors, as we also saw with the IMAC, we saw with the INSTC. And given we went into neighborhood, when we talk about that peace policy, the situation in Myanmar with the conflict, a lot of connectivity projects have delayed. And in the same way with the both IMAC and INSTC, also at the end of the corridors, we see conflicts, be it in Gaza or be it in Ukraine. So how do you really see the corridors playing out in the larger spectrum of Indian foreign policy? If you could shed some light on it, all three of you, it's very open. Yeah.
Thank you. And we're going to take one more question.
Hi, namaste. Just a quick question regarding India's view of the UN, the relevance of the UN in the international system nowadays. You seem to say that, they may be left behind, the Security Council and the General Assembly. So just overall, your opinion on that.
Maybe that one last question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Preeti. I'm a journalist reporting on global health here. There's a perception that, we often find that geopolitical dynamics in foreign policy also reflects in global health. And there's a perception that India's leadership in the developing world has been waning, particularly in the global south. And it seems that our priorities have shifted from being a multilateral player to what you've spoken about, that, we're driven by interests, bilateral interests. But this has consequences for the developing world. If you could comment on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all those excellent questions. I'm now going to, who would like to?
Well, let me take the first one as the American, I think, on the panel, because the question about the U.S. elections, I think the other panelists would be far better suited to take the other question. So the question is, what would a Harris presidency mean for India? And I think the answer is not very much in the following sense, which is that I think that, of course, if she were to be victorious, which today is a coin flip, roughly, her chances, there would undoubtedly be, quite a lot of excitement in India about somebody whose mother was an Indian immigrant reaching the highest position in the land, as there would be the same level of pride amongst, the Indian American community. But I think one of the most remarkable things about the India relationship with the United States is that it is one of the rare issues, one of the few issues that both parties completely agree on. I mean, even if you go back and you think about all of the turmoil of the Trump years, right, where we were seeing reversals on climate policy, on Iran, a different approach on China, there was relatively little disturbance on India. Yes, I mean, there was some talk about bilateral trade deficits, questions about immigration, H-1Bs, and so on and so forth. But it was actually a place where for 25 years, there's been a strategic bet that has been shared by both Democrats and Republicans, right? And so that's pretty remarkable in a country that's as divided and polarized as ours, right? So I think going forward, my submission would be there's going to be a lot more uncertainty and volatility if we were to see a Trump presidency, because that is the nature of the former president himself, where we'll see a lot more continuity. But I think India could be one of those places where actually the needle doesn't really move too far in any one direction.
Thank you.
I mean, we don't need that. That's right. Sorry, I forgot. I'm going to leave all of the difficult questions about the UN, global health, and multilateralism, and just sort of, in a sense, echo Milan's point. I mean, it is. If I were to put it very crudely, I wrote a piece about this. I feel like Europeans are totally panicked about the prospect of a Trump presidency. The world will end. In Asia, where until a few months ago I was living, actually, you don't get that feeling at all. There's a real kind of feeling of sang-froid, sort of it's okay. Trump was, it was a bit of turbulence, but it was okay last time. So there's a bit of hubris, like we managed that well. I feel like that is to underestimate the turmoil that would follow a second Trump administration. But I do agree with Milan that if I look around Asia and I think, which of the big countries is best placed to kind of ride out the turmoil, and I think it is India. Trump likes Modi and he likes India for reasons that are kind of sort of sui generis to himself. It's partly a kind of like a gut feeling. It's partly that India doesn't have a trade surplus. It's partly ideological, as in there is a kind of affinity between elements of the BJP and elements of the American right in a kind of curious way. And so I feel like were Trump to win, then India we'll see, but amongst the better placed countries to kind of ride out that turbulence, and that this long-term sort of strategic bet that the US is making on India and India is making on the US is likely to continue. I mean, there's no sure thing in international geopolitics. You can't be sure, but I think that's the most likely. Ambassador, difficult question to you.
No, he answered as an American, I'll answer as an Indian. But I think, we were very happy when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister of London. I mean, it brought back some very nice, memories about colonialism and reverse colonialism. So I think Indians are going to be really happy to see a Desi as sitting in the White House. But no, seriously speaking, I think the relationship, and here I'm in agreement, it's reached a certain level of maturity, which seems to be immune to who is sitting in the White House. But these are early days because the world has changed a lot. Modi will be dealing with his fourth president in his tenure. I mean, in January, he would be dealing with a fourth US president, and that's quite a record. So on the corridors, I think this is exactly what I was trying to say, that if established institutions are not functioning effectively, then what you're seeing is the emergence of new. And the most recent, of course, is the IMEC. So I think everyone's very optimistic about IMEC, but there are these force majeure clauses. I mean, when IMEC was signed last year, it was before the 7th of October. So all bets were off in the last 1 year. But let us see. But the idea of connecting India to Europe and beyond via a route that is not the Suez Canal is a fundamental idea, which was at the genesis also of the Russian North-South transport corridor. I think as the Indian economy grows, you will see greater impulses on such connectivity. But a lot of it is beyond your control. It depends. I think the only region of stability in both corridors, both connectivities, is India, actually. On the global health and the UN, yes and no. I mean, during the COVID period, I think India was one of the few countries which actually really, stuck its neck out with sharing of vaccines and medication and everything else. So there are both models at play, the bilateral model and the multilateral. So, and so then when you talk about the UN Security Council and the General Assembly, to answer the other question, I think, look, there are parts of the UN system which have worked well for the developing world, and there are parts which have not. So I think you just have to first, to answer the question, it's probably the best way to answer it would be look at the particular sector in which you're talking of. For example, development, the development decades and the development agenda has really fallen off the radar in the last few years. And all of a sudden, we seem to be back to the post-World War era, where the only talk you hear is of international peace, security, conflict, war. So I think we need to, where necessary, reinvent, where necessary, reset these organizations. But where India has the comparative advantages, like in the neighborhood, etc., I think we are doing a hell of a lot on the health side, both regionally and bilaterally.
Thank you. So final thoughts. Each one of you, perhaps 1 minute. We have a very young audience here, so try to be optimistic. But how does the future look in terms of global stability over the next few years? Is there room for optimism, or should we be cautious? Do you believe India is truly poised to become a global economic and geopolitical powerhouse?
Yes.
No, I mean, I think there's plenty of reason for, I don't know if we're using microphones or not anymore.
No.
I have plenty of reason for optimism. In a sense, the world that India is trying to build is a world that is much fairer, which will be it is a world that is no longer dominated by people in Europe or North America. That's a good thing. The transition will be complicated, but the world that India is trying to build will be one, touch wood for all of us, that will be more ecologically sustainable. I just don't think we can't be naive about how complicated this will be in an era of greater geopolitical contestation. It means that at a moment in which we need global institutions of the sort that are studied in an institution like this to work well, they're likely to work less well, and therefore countries are going to have to work harder, diplomats are going to have to be smarter in order to achieve the kind of development and other goals that we need. So.
Thank you. Milan?
No, I just think, hard to know where to go with this question. Not a lot of signs of optimism, but let me just say something about India and coming back to a couple of things that the ambassador and James mentioned. I do think that there is a much clearer-eyed recognition and understanding of India's fundamental national interests in world capitals. And that includes places like London and Paris and Washington and Brussels, right? When I think about India's position on Russia-Ukraine, there was a 48-hour period of consternation and condemnation before people in places like the US government started to say, okay, actually, this could be a potential opportunity to try and help India diversify away from a single source supplier of arms imports, namely Russia, right? And that India, given its position, needs a reliable and cheap supplier of oil and gas, right? And there's limited sort of players it could go to. Even when we think about China, I think, my colleague Ashley Tellis had this viral essay last year in Foreign Affairs called India's Bad Bet, America's Bad Bet on India. And it wasn't his title, so it's a bit unfair to blame him. But the idea was that if there were to be a potential military conflict over Taiwan that would implicate the United States, one could not expect India to come to America's aid in a kind of coalition warfare style setup. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think anyone in Washington expects that, right? I think they know that diplomatically, India would lend its weight to the Western side or the American side and not with China. But there is also an understanding that given that India's interests wouldn't be directly threatened, that they would not necessarily contribute, soldiers to that effort. So I think there's a nuance now around Indian foreign policy that maybe didn't exist 10 or 15 or 20 years ago.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah, just to take off from Milan's last point, look, we've had 100,000 soldiers facing each other between India and China. I mean, India doesn't have to prove its readiness to confront China, to defend its and the rest of the world's interests. I mean, when I said tanks were 50 meters from each other, that's true. There were 100,000 troops, that's true. There were hundreds of helicopters, planes, artillery, radar, that's true. So which country in the world in the contemporary era has faced China the way India has? So I think that debate should be settled. On the Taiwan, I agree with Milan. There is a question mark, and I think there is a discussion going on between, but there are so many imponderables in that scenario that it's very difficult to give a definitive answer. In terms of your question, I'm saying, what I would like to say is, as an Indian, I'm optimistic about the future. But if you ask me about the state of the world, I'm not so sure.
Let's just leave it at that then. Modi government is navigating a period of rapid geopolitical shifts and domestic transformations. On the domestic front, it's balancing economic growth with social harmony, job creation, and infrastructure development. These are all crucial to its status also in domestically, but internationally, India is stepping into a more assertive global role, and it must handle its relationship now with China, the US, and Russia delicately in the Quad, in the BRICS. Security challenges, both internal and external, remain a persistent challenge that will require vigilance, modernization, and strategic foresight. So it is navigating very multifaceted challenges, but as you can see from these panelists, we can be optimistic. So on that note, I would like to thank all of you for staying with us to the end. And I also want to thank our partnership with Nico. Thank you so much, Asia Society Switzerland, for being here with us. And I also like to thank my colleagues, Ines, Florian, and Linda Madutz, who has made this happen. So all a peaceful evening, and I'll see you at the next Geneva Security Debate, hopefully in the coming weeks. Thank you.
But I didn't want to miss the middle of the conference, so it's now.